Well, we don't know where the Neanderthals last existed. Gibraltar is certainly one of the places where we have relatively late dating. I think by 39,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had pretty largely disappeared over their whole range from Spain to Siberia.
If we look at evolution in some way and ourselves as some kind of pinnacle of evolution, then everything else has to have a secondary position. If we colonized the world, it must have been because we were in some way better than the others. This idea of the replacement model. People come out of Africa and they replace the Neanderthals. It could be in an active way. At one point people thought it was a kind of genocide, or through competition. But whatever way, it had to be because we replaced the others. Well, where's the evidence of that? Show me the evidence. When you look at a stratigraphy in a cave, you have Neanderthals, and then above you have modern human levels. Therefore, they replace the others. But my answer to that is, well, that scenario has two interpretations. You have Neanderthal levels, the modern humans came and replaced them, or you had Neanderthals, and it was only when they went away that the modern humans came. You would observe the same thing in the archaeology. If you consider that modern humans were in the Middle East around 100,000 years ago, and they reached Australia 60,000 years ago, which is a long way from the Middle East, why does it take them until 45,000 years ago to reach Europe, which is round the corner? And my own view is that it's because there are Neanderthals in Europe and not on the route to Australia, and perhaps the Neanderthals were competitively doing very well and keeping our ancestors out.
But I think the last Neanderthals were struggling. We know genetically the Neanderthals were challenged. They had very low diversity, very low numbers, and I think that's partly because the unstable climates of Europe and Asia were constantly whittling away their genetic diversity.
A lot of the habitat that the Neanderthals were used to, the forested areas where they could ambush hunt, were gradually disappearing. And whereas they were intelligent enough to try and adapt by making different kinds of tools, different kinds of, their body shape couldn't adapt fast enough biologically to the kind of change that they were experiencing. Imagine there are sites in Italy, for example, with pollen records that show that within the space of 100 years, an area would go from a deep forest into an open plain without a single tree. Imagine that you're experiencing that and you're trying to adapt, but you don't have the physique for that kind of world. Then it's just bad luck that it happened that way. Whereas our own ancestors, who were perfectly well capable of dealing with open plains that they had in Africa, suddenly found a moment of luck where they could spread into this world. Instead of wildebeest, they had reindeer, but effectively the way of capturing them was the same. But of course it could have been the other way. I mean, I always say, had the climate warmed and got wetter instead of colder and drier, we might be Neanderthals today discussing the demise of the modern humans.
But of course they live on in our DNA because we've got something like 2%, many of us, in our DNA of Neanderthals.
The biological species concept, if you interbreed and produce viable offspring of the same species, then we're the same species as Neanderthals.
Well, we've now got genomes of Neanderthals, some high quality ones from the fossils, and also, of course, we've got huge amounts of data from recent humans. So if we think of humans today, almost everyone outside of Africa has around 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. And the actual content of the Neanderthal DNA varies a little bit from one person to another.
We can puzzle these pieces together and see that around 40 or 50% even of the Neanderthal genome is still around. And one can estimate the date for when this admixture happened. And it's somewhere in the order of 40 to 60,000 years ago or so.
A small group of modern humans came out into Asia, and then they met Neanderthals, and there was some interbreeding. And we picked up some DNA, and as modern humans spread, they took that bit of Neanderthal DNA with them.
The Neanderthals were quite well adapted. They'd lived in Europe and Western Asia for 200, 300,000 years before modern humans arrived. And when we arrive and we interbreed with them, what we take away and what rises in frequency and what we see today are those variants that allowed them to live and survive in that habitat. Now, some of those things are advantageous today still, but some of them are also disadvantageous. They're bad for us and they might cause disease.
For example, there seems to be a correlation of Neanderthal DNA and people suffering from the risk of strokes. So it seems possible that Neanderthals had evolved mechanisms for faster blood clotting, and in the dangerous conditions of the old Stone Age, that would have been advantageous. So our ancestors may have picked that up 40 or 50,000 years ago to help healing of wounds. Now that was good then in that dangerous world, but in our modern lifestyles you have this increased risk of strokes. And of course it's quite likely that Neanderthals had developed natural immunities to some of the local diseases in Europe and Asia. We didn't have those immunities, having evolved in Africa. So coming out into Eurasia, by interbreeding with the Neanderthals, we got a quick fix to our immune systems, and we picked up some of those disease resistance factors which helped us survive.
So perhaps instead of seeing a world in Eurasia 45,000 years ago of moderns and Neanderthals, we should see a world of a few moderns, a few Neanderthals and a lot of hybrids.
Yes, so it does muddy the waters about these species concepts, because certainly at school I was taught the biological species concept, which is that species don't interbreed, they are reproductively isolated.
I'm not sure what being able to define a species in this kind of scenario, in this kind of human comparison scenario, what it adds. I'm not sure that it's a useful concept for us. I like to refer to them rather as groups or populations, perhaps.
If you call them lineages, then you get out of the trouble.
They don't have a chin.
So they didn't seem to mind when it got to mating rituals or whatever.
No.
You're taping all this, aren't you?
Yeah.
Once you've pigeonholed things into species, then you run into trouble. We're never suggesting that Neanderthals and modern humans were the same. What we're suggesting is that they were comparable in their abilities, and the more we look at them, the more we realize that that was the case. The discoveries we've made in Gibraltar are helping to reshape, if you like, the way we understand Neanderthals. Till as recently as perhaps 10 years ago, people would argue that a lot of the behaviors that we observe, for example, in modern humans in South Africa, were the hallmark of humanity. And these features included the exploitation of marine mollusks, beachcombing, exploitation of marine mammals, the ability to catch birds, which were thought to be beyond the capabilities of the Neanderthals. They wouldn't have the technology or know-how. And our work here in Gibraltar has gradually shown that Neanderthals were beachcombing at the same time as the modern humans were doing it in South Africa. And you can see here lots of shellfish, marine intertidal mollusks. You see limpets, other kinds of shells, scallops, all the way. The more you look, the closer you look, the more you see. They were having a nice shellfish barbecue or a feast. We found hunting, or at least butchering, seals, and we also found dolphins of two species with the seals, suggesting that the whole idea of marine exploitation was also something that they did on a regular basis. And then perhaps the trickiest one, the birds. Why do we have, as fossils, 151 species now of birds recorded in these two caves in Neanderthal context? Now 151 species for Europe today is 29% of all the birds of Europe. Two caves, that's really quite dramatic. But perhaps the most striking thing was when we started to realize that it wasn't just for food.
Esta es una centrípeta ya.
That's very sharp.
Sí. Lo que hemos realizado es una imitación de uno de los varios tipos tecnológicos que se encuentran en Gorham Cave o en Vanguard Cave. Hay una tecnología que es la Levallois, ¿vale? Que es la más típica del musteriense, pero nosotros hemos hecho la reconstrucción de una variación algo más sencilla, que es la centrípeta, y que vamos a aplicar con la misma materia prima, vamos a aplicar sobre el animal que vamos a trabajar.
The taphonomists that have been working alongside our team in Gorham's Cave have found a lot of vulture bones with a lot of cut marks, and those cut marks on specific bones have shown that Neanderthals were cutting these vultures as well as eagles in specific ways to release the feathers. What we're going to do is we're going to carry out an experiment using similar tools that Frank has just made for us to see exactly how we could simulate what the Neanderthals were doing. It's taken us quite a while, but the whole carcass has come off in one piece, the skin is intact, and it's holding all of the feathers in place.
So when you actually dissect something like a vulture or an eagle, you'll realize, because they're soaring birds, that when you actually dissect the wing, there's no meat there. It's just bone and tendon holding the feathers.
Exactly, yeah. It's just
Gradually we realized also that they were being selective. It was particular kinds of birds of prey that had dark feathers. The ones that had paler feathers seemed to be less represented in the sample. So the conclusion essentially was that it seemed that these people were catching these birds not just for food, but for their feathers, for using them as capes, or for using the feathers for adornment. And of course that already takes you to another level. So the last bastions of those who defend the difference between Neanderthals and us was, but they didn't have the cognitive capacities that we had. To show they had the ability to be symbolic was a major step. And the culmination of that was the discovery, not so long ago now, of an actual engraving made by the Neanderthals. I think they probably lived a good life. Food resources were good. We know that they were eating all kinds of things, from shellfish to plants, pine seeds, there were olives growing here. It's not just the big game. They had a good selection of plants and animals. They had fresh water, and I suspect that probably the Neanderthal life included a lot of spare time where they had time to think. They weren't just surviving.
It's very difficult to find an engraving or a piece of art that can be demonstrated to be Neanderthal in a way that this has been.
This is Gorham's Cave right behind me. It was used by Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years. It's at the base of this massive cliff, which is Gibraltar, and the Neanderthals from here would then walk out of here and go out into the hunting fields, which what is now the Mediterranean Sea would have been a field of dunes with lakes and quite a diversified environment. So this was in some way Neanderthal city. It's a place where we have a line of caves, probably the highest concentration of Neanderthals anywhere that we know. The caves seem to have been ideal habitat for the kind of lifestyle that we think the Neanderthals were living. It's almost a cathedral type cave, and it's very difficult sometimes to visualize it until you're actually here. In the middle section of the cave, you have a lot of natural light coming in. They seem to be doing a lot of their domestic activities there. We find campfires, we find a lot of evidence of deer, other mammals as well, but mainly red deer in this particular site. But then the fun was that we found that when the Neanderthals finished and left, they obviously left bits of meat around, and hyenas came in. We know they came in to scavenge because they left behind their, what we call coprolites, which is fossil dung, basically. The hyenas ate what they found, pooed and left, essentially. But deeper in the cave, we find other fires, which is very unusual. Neanderthals tend not to have campfires deep in the cave. But here, because the roof is so tall, it almost has a natural chimney, they seem to have campfires there as well. And behind that, you have chambers where they could have slept protected by the fires from all the predators that were around, like the hyenas and the lions and the leopards that would have come in. So if you like, the cave, they used the space in different ways, depending on what activities they were doing.
And this area here, if I just take my hat on, I might be able to light it up for you. This is the area of the famous Neanderthal etching or engraving.
What is it?
Well, you know, we don't really know, and we've always stopped short of calling it art. But what we do know about it is that it's certainly something that somebody decided to engrave, and there was purpose to it. It wasn't something that happened by mistake, or it wasn't as a result of a doodle. When you look at it closely, you can actually see the different striations as each time the tool that was used has passed and dug into the rock. And the deepest one has actually 60 individual strokes to make the deepest one. They were made in sequence, in a specific order, and the order wasn't changed as they were being made. So they were making one vertical line, then the horizontal, then another vertical. So some thought process was going on. The difficulty, of course, is trying to get into the mind of the person making, and I don't think we can ever do that. We know that more modern people have cave art, but this was the first time that it could be demonstrated without any doubt that it was Neanderthal. And one of the reasons that we could demonstrate this was quite by chance. One of the sections that we have close by shows a very diagnostic Neanderthal tool, of which there is no doubt whatsoever that it was made by the Neanderthals, and that's about 20 to 30 centimeters above this engraving. Then what's below it can only be Neanderthals because the modern humans hadn't arrived yet.
We're still battling in certain quarters to say to people and make people understand, you know, these people were humans. They may have been different, may have had a different culture, a different way of thinking, some things we may never know, but they were human.